On a quiet evening, under the glow of streetlights, a man was walking home after a long day at work. He wasn't expecting any trouble. His thoughts were on the upcoming promotion at his office, a well-earned reward for years of dedication. He had worked hard to prove himself in a career that hadn't always been easy. As he walked, he was lost in thought, unaware of the group of officers standing by the street corner. The officers were laughing among themselves, their voices loud in the cool night air. They seemed to be in high spirits, but it wasn't the kind of happiness anyone would want to share. They had an attitude that made them believe they could do anything, without any fear of consequences. The officers had a reputation for bullying people, especially those they thought were weaker or easier to intimidate. But they didn't realize that the man they were about to approach was someone they would soon regret underestimating. As the man walked past the group, one of the officers, with a smug grin, stepped forward and flicked his cigarette. Without warning, the officer took the lit end and pressed it against the man's arm, as if to prove a point. The pain shot through the man's arm like a bolt of electricity. He flinched but kept his composure. He didn't respond with anger or a fight. Instead, he looked up at the officer, his eyes calm but firm. The officer laughed, thinking the man would cower or react in fear. He enjoyed having power over others, especially those who seemed defenseless. The rest of the officers joined in the laughter, clearly enjoying the situation. They didn't expect the man to do anything about it. But the man, while feeling the burn, didn't show any signs of fear. Instead, he stood still, knowing this was no ordinary encounter. There was something more at play here, and he was not going to let them take advantage of him. His heart beat steadily, the pain from the burn on his arm only fueling his focus. He had faced worse in his life, but this moment was different. He understood the power of his role, and he knew that sometimes it was important to stay calm in the face of unfairness. The officer who had hurt him smirked, thinking it was over. The others, still laughing, didn't think much of it either. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The man took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the situation on his shoulders. He wasn't just some random person. He wasn't just a bystander in their little game. He was the one who would bring change to this precinct. The officer, caught up in his own arrogance, had no idea that the man he had just burned was about to change everything. This wasn't going to be a story of revenge. It was a story of standing up for what was right and proving that justice would always find a way. As the man walked away from the group, the officers remained unaware of his true identity. They thought they had the power, that they were in control. But in reality, they had just made the biggest mistake of their careers. The man, silently burning on the inside, knew it was time to act. The game was about to change, and the officers would soon learn that the man they had just hurt was the one who could make their lives a lot more difficult. But for now, he kept his head high, holding back his anger. The real confrontation was yet to come. The man, still feeling the sting on his arm, walked away from the group of officers without saying a word. His thoughts were clear, focused. He knew the weight of the situation. He wasn't just any person on the street. He had worked hard for years, proving his worth in his job. What the officers didn't know was that the man they had just wronged was about to become the new chief of the precinct. This promotion wasn't something that had come easily. It had been earned through years of dedication, overcoming countless challenges, and fighting to prove that he belonged in the top ranks. He had worked his way up from the ground level, starting as a rookie officer, learning everything there was to know about law enforcement, from the smallest details to the most important cases. He had taken every opportunity to learn, always striving to do his best, even when others doubted him. The journey had not been easy. He had witnessed the highs and lows of the precinct, the struggles and triumphs of his colleagues. Over time, he had gained the trust and respect of those around him. His leadership had started to shine, and he became someone others looked up to for guidance. He had built a reputation for fairness and integrity, something that wasn't always easy to maintain in a field where corruption sometimes ran deep. But through it all, he never lost sight of why he chose this path in the first place: to make a difference, to protect and serve, and to bring justice where it was needed most. As he walked further away from the officers, he reflected on how this promotion was not just for him, but for everyone who had supported him along the way. The man knew this position came with immense responsibility. Being the chief of the precinct meant he would be in charge of making decisions that affected the entire force and the community. He had a vision for how things should change, a vision of fairness, respect, and accountability. The way things had been done before had to change. Too many officers had taken their power for granted, mistreating people, abusing their authority, and forgetting the very principles they swore to uphold. The man's thoughts shifted to the officers who had just disrespected him. They were ignorant of who he was, and that would cost them. He had spent years observing, learning the inner workings of the precinct and understanding its flaws. Now, as the new chief, he had the power to make real changes. The officers who thought they could get away with their behavior would soon realize that their actions had consequences. This was his chance to make a real difference, to address the problems he had witnessed over the years, and to ensure that those who served under him upheld the highest standards of integrity and respect. As he approached his home, the weight of the day's events began to settle on him. But it wasn't the burn on his arm that bothered him the most. It was the realization that there were still people in positions of power who didn't understand the responsibility that came with it. He knew he would have to deal with them soon enough. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of peace, knowing that tomorrow would bring a chance to right the wrongs, to show that even in the face of disrespect, integrity would always shine through. The change was coming, and it would start with him. The man sat quietly in his home that evening, the burn on his arm a constant reminder of the earlier encounter. Yet it wasn't the physical pain that lingered most in his mind. It was the way he had been treated, the injustice of the officers' actions. He couldn't stop thinking about how they had assumed they could walk all over him, unaware of who he truly was. It made him more determined than ever to bring real change to the precinct, to stand up for what was right, and to ensure that no one else would be treated in such a cruel, careless way. As he sat in the silence of his living room, he reflected on the journey that had led him here, to this point of power and responsibility. His path had not been an easy one. There were so many obstacles he had faced, so many times when others had doubted him, dismissed him, or tried to hold him back. But through it all, he had kept moving forward. He had worked harder, learned more, and always strived to be better. And now, as the new chief of the precinct, he was in a position to make sure that the mistakes of the past were not repeated. The more he thought about the situation, the more he realized that he had to act. It wasn't enough to just let the officers' actions slide, to let them think that what they did was acceptable. He needed to make a statement. He needed them to understand that there were consequences for their actions, that no one, no matter their rank, was above accountability. This wasn't just about revenge or getting even. It was about creating a culture of respect, fairness, and integrity. It was about showing that the values of the precinct weren't just words on paper. They were principles to be lived by every single day. The man stood up from his chair, walking over to the window and looking out at the city skyline. It was a peaceful evening, the sky painted with soft hues of pink and orange as the sun began to set. But inside, his mind was racing, already planning his next steps. He had to address the officers who had disrespected him. But he also had to make sure that the culture of the precinct changed from the inside out. The work ahead would be difficult, but he was ready for it. He had spent years preparing for this moment. His phone buzzed on the table, snapping him out of his thoughts. He picked it up and saw a message from a trusted colleague in the department. It was a simple note, reminding him that tomorrow was the day he would officially start his role as chief. The weight of the responsibility hit him all over again, but this time, it didn't feel overwhelming. It felt like a challenge he was ready to face. He knew that in order to be the leader the precinct needed, he had to lead by example. He had to show the officers that respect and accountability were non-negotiable, and that anyone who crossed the line would face the consequences. The man set the phone down and took a deep breath. Tomorrow would be the beginning of something new. He had the power to make a difference, and he was determined to use it wisely. The road ahead would be tough, but he had faced challenges before. He had learned how to navigate difficult situations, how to stay calm when others panicked, and how to stand firm when it seemed like everything was against him. Now, more than ever, he was ready to do what needed to be done. He was no longer just a man walking down the street. He was the new chief, and he was about to change everything. The next day, the man walked into the precinct, his new role weighing on his shoulders like a heavy but necessary cloak. He had known this day would come, but now that it was here, it felt both real and surreal at the same time. The officers, the ones who had mocked him the night before, had no idea who he was. They still went about their duties as though nothing had happened, unaware that the man they had disrespected was now in charge. He walked through the halls, taking in everything around him. The precinct was busy, as usual, with officers moving quickly from one task to another. But today there was something different in the air, a quiet anticipation, though no one knew exactly why. His colleagues, the ones who respected him, gave him nods of acknowledgement as he passed, but it wasn't long before he reached his office. There, sitting at his desk, he paused for a moment to collect his thoughts. The man sat down, his hands resting on the desk as he looked at the papers before him. The role he had earned was one of great responsibility, but he had never been one to shy away from responsibility. He had always believed that leadership wasn't about having power. It was about making the right choices and ensuring those choices helped others. Today, he would make a choice that would have an impact on the precinct, one that would set the tone for everything that followed. He picked up the phone, his fingers steady as he dialed the number of the officer who had put the cigarette out on his arm. He didn't need to be dramatic or harsh. He just needed to be clear and firm. The officer answered quickly, his voice casual, unaware that the man he had disrespected was about to speak. "Officer," the man said, his voice calm but unwavering, "I need to speak with you and your colleagues in my office right now." The officer was taken aback, but he agreed, hanging up quickly to inform the others. The man could hear their murmurs in the background, their confusion and uncertainty growing as they gathered in his office. A part of him felt a sense of satisfaction, knowing they were finally about to realize the gravity of what they had done. But he wasn't out for revenge. He wasn't looking to humiliate them. What mattered most was making it clear that their actions were unacceptable, that disrespect had no place in this precinct. Moments later, the officers filed into the room, their faces slowly changing as they saw who was sitting behind the desk. They had been expecting to face some kind of punishment, but they had no idea that the man they had insulted was now the chief of the precinct. The silence in the room was thick, the officers unsure of how to react. The man didn't immediately speak. He just stared at them, waiting for them to realize the situation they were in. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice calm but strong. "I am the new chief of this precinct, and I will not tolerate this kind of behavior. Not from anyone, no matter their rank." The officers stood still, their faces pale, as the weight of his words sank in. They didn't know what to say, and there was nothing they could say to undo what had already been done. But the man wasn't looking for excuses. He wasn't interested in hearing justifications or apologies that came too late. What mattered now was what came next. "I'm not here to make this personal," he continued, his tone unwavering. "But there will be consequences. We work for the people, and that means we treat everyone with dignity and respect. This cannot, and will not, happen again." The room remained silent. The officers knew their mistake had been grave, and though some might have wanted to argue, there was nothing to be said. They had crossed a line, and now it was time to face the music. The man wasn't interested in retaliation. Instead, he focused on the bigger picture, creating a future where respect and fairness were not just expected but required. As the officers left the room, there was a quiet shift in the air. They understood that their actions had consequences, and they would be held accountable. The man knew this was just the beginning, that real change would take time. But today, He had made his point loud and clear. No one, not even those in positions of power, were beyond reproach. The days that followed were filled with a mix of tension and change. The man, now firmly established in his new role as chief, wasted no time in beginning his work to reshape the precinct. It wasn't just about punishing those who had wronged him. It was about creating a culture where respect and integrity weren't optional. He knew that real change had to come from within, and it would start with him setting the example. The officers who had made that careless mistake were under close scrutiny. They had been temporarily reassigned to less visible duties while an internal review process was underway. The man had no intention of letting their behavior slide, but he was also careful to follow the proper procedures. He knew that justice wasn't about acting out of anger or frustration. It was about doing things the right way, even when it seemed easier to lash out. For the first time in a long while, the precinct felt different. The officers who had once laughed and joked about their authority were now quieter, more reserved. They understood that their actions had consequences, and while some still resented the change, they knew the new chief wasn't someone who could be easily pushed around. His leadership was calm but firm, and it was clear that he wasn't just looking to shake things up for the sake of it. He was looking to make the precinct better, for everyone. The chief took his time meeting with various teams within the department. He walked through the halls, speaking with officers one-on-one, asking them about their experiences, their concerns, and their suggestions for improvement. He wanted to understand the inner workings of the precinct in ways that most leaders would never bother to. He wasn't interested in simply giving orders from his office. He was a leader who believed in listening and learning, understanding that each officer's perspective could bring something valuable to the table. During these meetings, it became clear that many officers felt stifled by the old way of doing things. There was a sense of frustration, of being ignored or dismissed by those in charge. The chief listened attentively, acknowledging their concerns and promising to make the changes that were necessary. He wasn't going to make empty promises. He was going to show them that he meant it. But he also made it clear that respect and accountability were non-negotiable. He didn't expect anyone to be perfect, but he did expect them to act with integrity. He reminded them that their duty was not just to enforce the law, but to serve the community with honor. Every action they took, every decision they made, reflected on the entire department, and he wanted them to remember that. Meanwhile, the officers who had wronged him the night of the incident were still on probation. They knew the consequences were coming, but the chief wasn't rushing to make a decision. He believed in fairness, and they were going to get the opportunity to explain their actions, to make their case. He wasn't about to make a rash decision based on emotion. He was taking his time, gathering all the facts, and ensuring that any punishment handed down was fair and just. As the days turned into weeks, the changes began to show. The atmosphere in the precinct felt less tense, more cooperative. Officers were working together in ways they hadn't before, and there was a renewed sense of purpose. The chief's leadership style was beginning to take hold, and while it wasn't easy, the results were clear. Respect was becoming the foundation of everything they did. The man, still recovering from the events that had led him to this point, couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. It wasn't about revenge or holding a grudge. It was about doing what was right. And slowly but surely, the precinct was becoming a place where integrity wasn't just talked about, it was practiced every single day. He knew that the road ahead would be full of challenges, but for the first time in a long while, he felt confident that real change was possible, and he was ready to lead it. As the weeks went by, the precinct continued to shift, albeit slowly. The chief was careful, patient, and strategic in how he approached every situation. He understood that lasting change wasn't going to come overnight. It was going to take time, trust, and a shared commitment from everyone involved. But he wasn't discouraged. In fact, he was more determined than ever to create the kind of environment where respect wasn't just a rule, but a way of life. The officers who had been temporarily reassigned began to report back to regular duties, but now things were different. The chief didn't just let them return to their posts without a word. He made it clear that there was an ongoing process of evaluation, and they would need to prove that they had learned from their mistakes. It wasn't about punishment, it was about growth. And if they were willing to put in the effort to change, they would be given the opportunity to redeem themselves. One afternoon, the chief called a meeting with those officers in his office. The room was quiet as they all sat, aware of the gravity of the moment. The chief didn't waste time with small talk. He spoke directly, his words calm but heavy with meaning. "We've been through a lot these past few weeks," he began. "I've given you the chance to reflect on your actions. And now, it's time to make sure you understand the seriousness of what happened, not just because it affected me, but because it affects the entire precinct." The officers listened intently, each one reflecting on the events that had transpired. They understood now that their actions weren't just an isolated mistake. They had impacted the reputation of the entire department, and their behavior had consequences beyond what they could have imagined. "We don't work in a vacuum," the chief continued. "Our actions, no matter how small they may seem in the moment, ripple out and affect everyone around us. I expect you to hold yourselves to the highest standards from here on out. Not because of who's in charge, but because of who we represent." The silence in the room was thick with understanding. The officers had been humbled. They realized that they were part of something much bigger than themselves. Their duty wasn't just to enforce laws. It was to serve the community with integrity, to set an example for those who looked up to them. It wasn't just about obeying orders. It was about doing what was right, even when no one was watching. The chief's words had an impact. They didn't just make the officers feel the weight of their actions. They made them feel responsible for the future. It wasn't just a lesson in discipline. It was a lesson in leadership and accountability. The chief wasn't interested in humiliation or punishment. He was interested in growth and in guiding his officers to become the kind of leaders the community could trust. As the meeting came to a close, the officers stood, nodding in acknowledgement. They knew that the chief wasn't going to let them off easy, but they also understood that he was giving them a chance to prove themselves. This wasn't the end of the conversation. It was just the beginning of a new chapter for them all. They were expected to earn back the trust they had lost, and they knew that it wouldn't be an easy task. The chief, for his part, felt a sense of pride. This was the kind of leadership he had always wanted to bring to the precinct. It wasn't about punishing those who had made mistakes. It was about showing them how to be better. He had faith that they would rise to the challenge. After all, true leadership wasn't about holding power over others. It was about empowering them to be the best versions of themselves. With the meeting behind him, the chief turned his attention back to the bigger picture. The precinct was changing, yes, but there was still a lot of work to be done. He wasn't going to stop until he had created a place where respect and integrity were the cornerstones of everything they did. And with each step, each conversation, each decision, he was one step closer to making that vision a reality. The chief spent every day of the following weeks working tirelessly to ensure that the changes he envisioned for the precinct were not only understood but also embraced. He wasn't going to let the challenges slow him down. He knew the journey to build a department founded on respect, accountability, and fairness was going to take effort from everyone involved. But the chief also understood that real leadership meant staying the course even when the road ahead seemed difficult. He continued to meet with officers individually, listening to their concerns and ideas for improvement. Many of them, especially the younger officers, had never experienced a leader who valued their input the way the chief did. They had grown accustomed to being told what to do without being given the chance to speak up. But now, with the chief at the helm, they were finding a voice they hadn't known they had. They felt valued, heard, and most importantly, they felt like their contributions mattered. The chief didn't just talk about the values of fairness and respect. He lived them. He made decisions based on what was best for the team, even if it wasn't the easiest choice. He had made it clear from the start that there would be no tolerance for anyone who mistreated others, but he also showed understanding. He knew that everyone made mistakes, but it was how people learned from them that truly mattered. His goal wasn't to punish, His goal was to help his officers grow. The officers who had been involved in the incident with him were still on probation, but they were proving themselves. Slowly, they were earning back the trust of their colleagues. The chief made sure that everyone knew that change wasn't just about following orders. It was about working together as a team, building trust, and supporting one another. He made it clear that a precinct was only as strong as its people, and if they didn't work together, they wouldn't succeed. He also started implementing new programs aimed at improving the relationship between officers and the community. The chief believed that trust had to be built not just within the precinct, but also with the people they served. He introduced community outreach initiatives, where officers volunteered at local events, visited schools, and attended town hall meetings. The idea was simple: show the people that the officers were there to protect and serve, not to intimidate. By building positive relationships, he hoped to create an environment where the community felt safe and valued. The change didn't happen overnight, but little by little, the precinct was beginning to transform. Officers began to speak with more respect, not just among themselves, but also with the citizens they interacted with. It was clear that something had shifted within the precinct. The work environment felt healthier, more supportive, and more aligned with the values the chief wanted to instill. The officers were becoming more than just law enforcers. They were becoming role models, leaders, and mentors. As the weeks went by, the chief saw that the foundation for the future was being laid. The officers who had once disregarded the importance of respect were beginning to understand what it truly meant to serve with integrity. The changes were subtle but meaningful. Officers who had previously been apathetic about their roles now showed a renewed sense of pride in their work. The precinct, once filled with tension, was now becoming a place where teamwork and accountability were the norms. The chief couldn't help but feel a sense of pride as he walked through the halls of the precinct. He had set out to create a place where respect was the foundation, and though there was still work to be done, he could see the beginnings of that change taking root. The officers were growing, not just as individuals, but as a unit. The respect they now showed each other was evident in every interaction, and the chief knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger transformation. The road to this point hadn't been easy, and there would be more challenges ahead, but the chief was no longer worried. He knew that with each step they took together, they were building something stronger, something better, and that, to him, was worth every effort. As the months went by, the chief continued to build upon the changes he had started. The precinct, once filled with tension and division, was now a place where respect, fairness, and accountability were no longer just ideals. They were part of the everyday routine. The atmosphere had shifted. There was a sense of unity among the officers, a shared understanding that they were working toward a common goal. The chief had always believed in leading by example, and now, as he walked through the precinct, he could see the fruits of his efforts. The officers who had once shown disrespect and arrogance were now working harder to earn the trust they had lost. It wasn't always easy, and there were still moments of hesitation and discomfort, but the chief could see the change in their attitudes. They were learning to be more thoughtful in their actions, more careful with their words. The lessons they had learned from their mistakes had started to sink in. They understood that they weren't just enforcers of the law. They were representatives of the community, and their actions reflected on the department as a whole. One of the biggest victories the chief had experienced wasn't just in seeing the change in his officers, but in how the community had started to respond. The outreach programs he had implemented had begun to make a real difference. Residents who once feared the presence of officers on their streets were now seeing them in a new light. They saw the officers volunteering their time, helping out at community events, and taking part in meaningful conversations. Trust was being rebuilt, one small interaction at a time. The chief was proud of the progress, but he knew there was still work to be done. The changes had begun, but they needed to be reinforced and maintained. He couldn't afford to let complacency set in. Every day, he was thinking about how to keep improving, how to continue building the kind of department that the community could rely on and be proud of. There would always be setbacks, challenges, and obstacles to face, but he was ready for them. He had learned the hard way that real leadership required persistence and patience. The respect that had been missing before was now part of the department's DNA. Officers were speaking to each other with more kindness, listening to one another's ideas, and working collaboratively to solve problems. There was a renewed sense of pride in the work they did, and that pride was contagious. The precinct wasn't just a place to work. It was a place where officers felt they could grow, learn, and contribute to something meaningful. It was a place where they didn't just clock in and out of their jobs. They truly cared about what they were doing. The chief's heart swelled with a quiet sense of accomplishment as he looked around at the officers working diligently. They weren't perfect, but they were better than they had been before. And that was all he had asked for. It wasn't about perfection, it was about progress. He had created an environment where people were encouraged to grow, to learn from their mistakes, and to help each other become the best versions of themselves. As the chief stood in his office one evening, looking out at the precinct below, he felt a sense of peace. He had started this journey with a clear goal in mind: to make the precinct a place of respect, fairness, and integrity. And while the work was far from over, he could see the tangible difference that had been made. The precinct was no longer just a place to work. It was a place where officers felt proud to serve, where the community felt safe, and where change was possible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new obstacles to face. But the chief wasn't worried. He knew that with the officers by his side, and with the trust of the community slowly but surely being restored, they were ready for whatever came next. This was just the beginning, and together, they would continue to make things better, one step at a time.